In this video, we are going to create a new query test for the exists keyword. So let's just create a new PHP class, exists test, and it extends test case again. And we are going to start with the first test, public function returns correct statement. Let's make it a test again. And we're going to start with query equals new exists this time. And let's import this class. Now the exists again will take the field name. We're going to do the same thing as before, so books ID. And then we are going to give it straight away subquery, so new pivot exists in class. Let's use this one. And here we are going to use author book for the table, then book ID for the select field, author ID for the where clause, and then end where we're going to look for books ID. And then we are going to indicate that we want to replace the value within the subquery, so true for the third argument. Okay, now if I just create a few new lines here, now let's prepare our expectation, which will be our SQL statement, which should read exists, and then within the brackets we should have, let me just indent it here, semicolon at the end, exists, and then subquery should be select book ID field, which is, as you can see, what we're passing here to this subquery. Then from table author book, again, this is what we're passing here as the first argument for the table, and then where author ID, the field which we pass through as a third argument to this pivot exists in this time, because this pivot exists in, if we click on this one, as you can see, operand is in this case, in, and it's going to be just one, and then end statement, book ID equals books ID. Now end book ID, which is basically the select field, equals books ID, this fourth argument to this pivot exists in, when we are, if we just go back, as you may remember, we've applied this field name, which basically creates the correct field name. If there is a full stop, we exploding this basically, and then obviously making sure that we have these backticks around this table and field name. Okay, so this is what we expect to get from this query when we run the statement method on it. So let's now do the assertion, assert equals, and this, again, we're going to use this trim white space, our expectation, so our SQL variable, and then this trim white space, query this time, we call method statement on it with array, which contains just integer 1. And then message that we're going to display in case this assertion fails is going to be exist statement with subquery returned incorrect statement. Okay, let's save it and try and run the test. And I'm going to run PHP unit, then tests, unit, database statement. We're going for query, and now exist test. And there we go, we've got a problem here. Let's see what the problem seems to be. Select, as you can see, what we are expecting apparently has this space here, which it shouldn't, because what happened when we actually converted this, if we just go back to our test case, you remember we are now converting, if there's a new line and multiple spaces, we're converting this to a single space. So in that case, if we go back to our test, now we have this single space because this select statement is on a new line, and the same goes for after this, before the closing bracket basically, which obviously our statement returned from the select from the statement method does not have. So let's try and fix this problem as well. Now, before we modify our trim white space methods, let's have a think about how we would like this method to return our statement. Well, looking at this statement here, the second line is exactly how I want it to be returned, meaning I want all SQL keywords to be separated with a single space. If there are brackets, I want the following keyword to be straight after the bracket without any space. Same for the closing bracket. I don't want any space between a last field name and the bracket. All keywords, as I said, we want a single space between a table and field names and so on. If there are any values within the brackets, I want to make sure there are no spaces between them, between the opening and closing bracket. And to achieve this, if we go back to our test case here, we've got this trim white space method. As you can see, if you are familiar with regular expressions, obviously this first one checks for the new line and then any number of white spaces. So if we look at the statement that we have here, this is where this would apply to. Also, it would apply here and this line and this line and so on. So all these cases would be replaced with a single space, which is why when we go back to the test, we are getting this space here because we're replacing this with a single white space. Now, probably what we could do is to indicate that if there is an opening bracket, we want to remove any spaces, and the same goes for if there is the closing bracket right after. And to do this, if we go back, let's add the first regular expression here. Let's add another one. In other words, we are going to start with the 2 forward slashes and then backslash to escape the opening bracket, the parenthesis, then backspace for the new line, backspace for any number of white spaces. So for this regular expression, and again, we're going to go back to the array format here, and let me just remove everything from this second argument. We are going to only return the opening bracket. So when we have something like this bracket, new line and any number of white spaces, replace it with just a single opening bracket. Now, the next one is going to be for the closing bracket. So again, next one is going to be 2 forward slashes. Let's just separate them by comma. 2 forward slashes. We start with a new line this time, then the number or any number of white spaces, and then backslash to escape the closing bracket. And for this regular expression, I want to replace it with the closing bracket. Then for the new line and any number of white spaces, I want to replace it with a single white space. And if there are still any multiple spaces remaining within the string, then replace them with just a single space. Okay, if we try and run a test now, let's do it again. And there we go. Now our test is passing. Let's try all of the tests as well. So PHP unit. And there we go. And all of the tests are also passing, meaning all of our previous tests, which were also using this trim white space, are now also working fine. Okay, let's go back to the editor. We can close this test case class and let's go back to our test. And let's create another session. I'm going to copy this SQL statement here and paste it after our assert equals. So now I expect this in to have question mark right after this, basically the placeholder for the value. And let's copy this assert equals as well and paste underneath. This time, rather than having this integer 1 as an array, I'm just going to pass it as a single value. And if we just go back to the statement just to see what's going to happen, now our statement now will receive a single integer 1. Then we check if it has subquery, and it does have subquery because if we go back, our exist, which is representing this query class, has the subquery, which is a second argument. And then we go for the subquery statement. If I click on this one, this will give me field, operand, and then subquery within the brackets. However, if we go back to our test, exist one overrides the subquery statement, as you may remember. So we only have the operand, which is going to be this exist, and then within the bracket, we're going to have our subquery, which is what we're expecting to get here. We have exist, space, and then brackets, and then our subquery goes there. So what happens next? If we go back to the query, when we are trying to run this subquery, we first check if the replace subquery returns true. If it doesn't, actually, because it's the opposite here using the exclamation mark. If it doesn't replace, if it shouldn't replace the subquery, if we go back, we are strictly specifying that we want to replace it. Then we also check if value is not an array, and in this case that's going to return true. This will return false, but this will return true because value is not of an array type. This is why we're going to just run subquery and query. In other words, on this pivot exists in, we are going to call the query method, which will return the statement, then end field and the auto field, which is what we're getting here. If we scroll down, there we go, which is what we get in here. But we don't have the value within the statement. This is only when we're passing array of arguments to the statement as the value. If we pass a single value, then it's going to be a simple placeholder for the prepared statement. And that's it. Okay, so let's now try and run the statement as well. So let's just go back. Let's run the test. And there we go. We have one test, two assertions, all of which are passing. Okay, so back to the editor and let's write the next test. But before I do this, let's just close the file browser on the left. Okay, and the next test will be public function returns correct boolean for has sub query. And it's a test. And we're going to start again with the query, simple query with new exists, and we're going to pass the field name, which is going to be books table ID. Then we are going to run the assertion. This assert false query has subquery. It should not have because we didn't pass any through. So exists has subquery returned true, which would only be displayed obviously if this assertion failed. Okay, let's run this test. Exists test. There we go. 2 tests, 3 assertions. After this, we are going to create another query. So query equals new exists. And this time we are going to pass the same field name, so books ID, but then we are also going to pass the subquery, so new pivot exists in, and for this one we are going to pass author book ID, then we have author ID, and lastly books ID. Okay, so now if we run the same statement, the same assertion, but rather than false, now we're expecting this to be true when we run this has subquery method on it. This time it should return false. If it fails, then obviously it returned false, which it shouldn't. It should return true. Okay, so if we save it, let's run the test again, and there we go, 2 tests, 4 assertions, all of which are passing. Okay, next test. Public function returns correct boolean for replace subquery. Basically, we're testing for this third argument of the query instance. Test, and we're going to start pretty much the same way. So let's quickly copy everything we have here actually in the previous test, and let's paste it in this test. First of all, we are renaming the method call. Here, rather than has subquery, we're going to call replace subquery. And let's obviously rename it within the message here as well. If it returned true, it shouldn't, then obviously that message should be displayed. So certainly false, replace subquery, because we didn't pass the third argument. And here, exactly the same thing, but we're going to pass the third argument as true, because by default it's false. And then we are asserting true now that we run this replace subquery. Obviously, if it failed, then it returned false. Okay, if we save it and run the test again, there we go, 3 tests, 6 assertions, so all good. And the last test in this video, because we will continue with this class, with this test class in the following one, last test for this video is going to check for the correct value. So public function returns correct value. And again, that's a test. Okay, and now what we're going to do, again, I'm going to copy this, these things here, but I'm not going to copy this last assertion. And we're going to remove this assert false. We are starting with a query which doesn't have second and third argument, and we are starting with the assertion assert equals. Now we are checking whether the value is going to be 1 when we run query value, and we pass just 1 through as an argument. And then exists value returned incorrect value. And then for the second one, we keep it the way it is, the instance of the query. And then we're going to go for this assert equals. It should return within the brackets 0 and 0 when we run query value, and we pass array of strings again, same thing as in the previous test. First value and then second value. This should be converted to integers because we don't allow embedding of values within the subquery. As strings, basically, they will be converted to integers. Exists value return incorrect value for subquery replacement with strings, with array of strings. Replacement T. There we go. So that's the first assertion, and then I'm going to duplicate this one, and the next one should be, say, 2 again and 18 if we pass array of integers 2 and then 18 and then the message replacement with array of integers. If we save it, now run the test, and there we go. All 4 tests and 9 assertions are passing.